This series of videos looks at the ending of the war. By the time we get to this point, Russia has left the war, and the war itself has been dragging on for years beyond the initial expectations. In the final movements of the war, the US joins the war, helping to turn the tide. And so Germany asks for armistice in 1918. And so part of looking at that is going to be this video, which looks at why did revolution break out in Germany in October of 1918. Remember that during total war, the home front, that is the civilians, are just as important and are heavily impacted by the fighting of the war. Generally, the home front needs to be managed as much as the actual fighting, which leads us to asking, why did the revolution break out in Germany in October 1918? And the hint here, of course, is that this is going to be about the home front. Unlike the UK and France, Germany mismanaged the home front. There were political problems and there was political instability rising from the conflict between those wanting more democracy, the people, and the traditional holders of power, the aristocracy and the emperor. And economically, the shift to the war economy meant very few consumer goods and food. And the extent of the war, coupled with mismanagement, meant that the populace just couldn't handle anymore. So the thing is that there were political problems in Germany from before the war. And essentially, the war acted as this huge pressure cooker. And it made everything worse. And one of the problems you can see here is the union, I guess, between Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff and Kaiser Wilhelm II. There were tensions politically between what the traditional ruling classes wanted and what the masses of the people wanted. Germany had been run as an absolute monarchy with very limited input from the people. And the problem was that the people wanted their voices heard while the traditional elites wanted to maintain their hold. During the war, Hindenburg and Ludendorff interfered so much with the running of the country that the years 1916 to 1918 are called by some historians the silent dictatorship. And these guys also had political and economic control over the company. And I imagine that these generals were all about winning the war at all costs, and they could not and were unwilling to balance the needs of the people with the needs of the war. And once the Schlieffen Plan had failed, it became basically about squeezing out as much as they possibly could from the people in order to fight the war and be successful. And on the other hand, the Reichstag, which previously just had like a advisorial role, like they didn't really have any political power, they became much more vocal. And they started questioning the direction of the war effort. And they started also questioning the organization of the government. And so they were questioning the power over the country exercised by Ludendorff and Hindenburg, and then also the Kaiser. There was a massive upswelling in political parties, and many of these political parties had conflicting aims, and some of them also had radical ideologies. So you have the communists, radical on the other side, on one side, wanting a complete overthrow of the government, and then you have the traditionalists, the aristocracy, wanting to keep things the way they had been in the previous centuries. And so essentially, the government was dysfunctional and people could not work together. In addition to the political instability, you have social instability. Many of the problems between the wealthy elites existed before the war. Again, the pressure of the war made things so much worse. Now, one of the things we've spoken about in the previous videos is that the German people were starving. And during the revolution itself, you can look at this image here. There was fighting in the capital between the government troops and the revolutionaries, and a horse was killed. Despite the flying bullets, people were so hungry, they ran out into the street to cut chunks of the horse so that they can have a meal. So just kind of think about the pressure that the people were under, and the anger and the hunger that forced them essentially to, one, try to take advantage of this dead horse in order to eat, but that this would also boil over to try to pressure the government to change things. So by 1917, the enthusiasm for the war had waned. There were severe shortages of food and important raw materials, and this was the result of two things. Number one was the British naval blockade, which you've spoken about extensively previously. And then number two was this balance between guns versus butter, or the balance between supplying the needs of the troops in the war and supplying the needs of the civilians. And essentially, what the generals did, Ludendorff and Hindenburg, was decided to reduce what was available for the population in order to supply the soldiers. And the combination of the blockade and this reduction of goods meant that the quality of life of the people was greatly reduced. All right. Now, also remember that the German government was extremely unprepared to fight a two-front war. And basically, they had no contingency plan on how to manage the society in order to do so. And by 1917, many people, especially the socialists, started questioning why Germany was still fighting the war. Keep in mind, again, that a lot of the people are dying are coming from the lower classes. So they're dying on the fronts and not having food to eat. And so people are dying on the front. People are also dying at home. Many people are starving due to malnutrition. And the other thing is you have deaths from disease and hypothermia. So in terms of disease, once people don't have enough food, their immune systems are compromised and can no longer keep them healthy. Also keep in mind, this is the time of the Spanish flu. And one of the critical materials that people didn't have was fuel. And so people died of hypothermia because Germany is not known for its warm, balmy winters, and people did not have enough fuel to heat their homes. In 1916, we had 121,000 people dead from disease and hypothermia. And by 1918, we had 293,000 people. Now, all of this, not having enough food and so on and so forth, bubbled over. And there was huge resentment toward wealthy industrialists. Industry during the war, the ones who were producing all of the guns and bullets and stuff, they made a crap ton of money. And they were unwilling to share that money with the people. So when we talk about the economic issues, you'll see more. But people didn't have enough money to buy food. There wasn't enough food available. And they didn't have enough money to be able to supply their needs. Well, at the same time, they saw some people get extremely wealthy from the war while they were dying. And so there were a huge number of industrial strikes. And these are led by the socialists and the communists as they try to force the industrialists to change their policies. Which brings us to this economic situation. Now, the political instability and the social instability were really triggered by the economic woes experienced by the people. Agricultural production had greatly reduced, worsening the food situation. As you can see in the picture, that people were basically trying to produce as much food or any food as they could. Here we have children working a field surrounding their school to try to produce food. The other thing that worsened everything is that the government financed the war through printing more money and by borrowing. And so this led to inflation. Now, the inflation was so high that the German mark had lost nearly all of its value by 1918. And this means that the value of people's earnings fell while the prices of goods increased. And so people had a very hard time meeting their needs. Their money couldn't buy as much, and the cost of goods had increased. And on top of that, the industrialists, instead of sharing the profits and giving them more benefits, essentially were hoarding the money themselves. So this meant that people were most upset. And in October 1918, you're going to have a revolution. There are two stages to this revolution, kind of the way Russia experienced two stages. But what Russia did over the course of months, Germany had over the course of weeks. And here we have one revolution was from above, and the second revolution was from below. Now, what do we mean by that? The revolution from above is called such because the massive changing of the German political system was instigated by the elites or by those who were already in power. And so the first stage of this revolution happened during the month of October, and it was a parliamentary monarchy. And it was really led by the gentleman, he's here, his picture, Prince Max von Baden. And Prince Max was a liberal monarchist, that is, someone who wanted to keep the monarchy, but wanted it shaped into a democracy similar to Britain. And Prince Max became the chancellor. And when he became chancellor, he formed a government with the liberal and socialist Reichstag members. Now, these members are people who wanted to see a massive liberalization of the German government. And they most definitely did not hold views towards the war that the military leaders did. And those military leaders were largely aristocrats. Another thing that encourages this parliamentary monarchy is that when Prince Max asked Wilson for an armistice, Wilson was like, no. He said that he would only discuss an armistice with the future representatives of the German people, not the military or the Kaiser. And the Germans took that to mean that if they were a democracy, then they would be able to achieve favorable terms ending the war. And it would be best when they sat down to the negotiating table, they were a democracy because the US, France, and Britain were all democracies. And so the Kaiser passed the October reforms, which transferred the power from the elites, the aristocrats, the Kaiser, to the Reichstag. Again, remember that previously the Reichstag was just there basically to be pretty. Now the Reichstag has the power to pass laws. Overnight, Germany went from pretty much an absolute monarchy to a parliamentary one. So we've looked at this revolution from above, which is coming from the people who already had power. Now we get to the revolution from below, which is a push by the masses of the people at the bottom of the power pyramid for additional political changes. And so in stage 2, we get to the constitutional democracy. And this was very, very quick. Now, the new government under Prince Max, they implemented some reforms, but they were a day late, y'all, a day late and $1 short. Because given the severity of the situation in Germany by this point, they were not enough. Also, the people realized that the war was lost. And when they realized this, a wave of unrest spread throughout Germany. Now, remember that every country censored and controlled the media during the war. And in the case of Germany, the government promised them victory for 4 years. They basically had no knowledge or understanding of the losses at the fronts. And they kept on promising this victory pretty much right until the end. So remember, we talked about all of those spring and summer offensives, and Germany was continually pushed back, and they straight up had lost. So the people did not know this, though. And they had been making sacrifices during the war. They had been dying at home. They had been dying fighting. And they had been told that they were winning and it would all be worth it. And now they realized that everything that they sacrificed was for nothing. And they felt betrayed when they realized that Germany had lost the war. The second stage of the revolution was sparked by a mutiny of sailors from the main naval bases at Kiel and Wilhelmshaven. Now, remember, although we have this event acting as the spark, it's not the true cause. All of the elements for this massive fire would have needed to have been there previously. And that spark just set it all ablaze. On October 31st, the sailors mutinied because of a plan by the Naval Supreme Commander, Admiral Scheer. Remember, we met this guy in the war at sea, not winning, but also not losing, at the Battle of Jutland. Now, Admiral Scheer decided to launch one last naval assault on Britain's high seas fleet to protect the honor of Germany. Now, these sailors were like, oh, hail to the no. They were tired, they were hungry, and they knew that the Allied powers were in discussion with the Germans about an armistice. And so most of them refused to return back to work from leave, or they refused to set sail. And so they basically took control of the Navy there. They set up soldiers' councils, similar to those in the Russian Revolution, and they also included the industrial workers of Kiel. Essentially, they set up councils to challenge the authority of the official government. Now, once the news spread of the mutiny and these councils, riots broke out across the country within a week. Now, one of the things that happened, for example, is Kurt Eisner tries to secede from Germany to establish the Bavarian Democratic and Social Republic on November 8th. And this was an idea to establish a socialist or communist state. Berlin was a hot mess of intrigue and fighting between the communists and the soldiers and the government and the other groups. It was extremely dangerous. There was fighting in the streets everywhere. All of this is going to result with the Kaiser abdicating, that is, giving up the throne. And the idea is that the people would calm down if the Kaiser was no longer leading the country, and people then had a democracy and a voice in there. And this also meant that Germany could exit the war, because the Kaiser was not welcome to the peace table. Wilson refused to let him participate in any peace talks, and all of the political and social chaos resulting from all of this resulted in a fear of civil war. Now, keep in mind that the revolutions in Russia had just happened the year previous. And Russia had fallen into civil war as soon as the Bolsheviks took over. And so there was this fear that the same thing would happen in Germany. And by the time we get to this point, the aristocrats are gone in Russia. The Tsar and his family have been killed. So this was a last-ditch effort to stabilize the country and exit the war. And so on November 9th, Prince Max announced the Kaiser abdicated, and he appointed the Social Democratic Party leader, Friedrich Ebert, as the new chancellor. And this armistice was signed on November 11th. Now, keep in mind, even when Germany was proclaimed a republic and the SPD was given control of the government, there were still different groups attempting to revolt, attempting to take control. And so Berlin was incredibly unstable from both groups fighting for control and the unrest from losing the war. And so the new National Assembly had to meet in a small town called Weimar in order to draft the new constitution. And as you can see from this image there, essentially, Ebert was given control of the country on November 9th, and on November 11th, they had to go meet with the Allied military and sign the armistice. And y'all know how that ended. Which brings to our summation. So take a minute, or really ideally more than a minute, and write a short essay that explains why there was revolution in Germany in 1918-1919. Now here I stopped at the declaration of the Republic. But again, for the year afterward, the revolution is still ongoing. Well, rather, the fighting to control the government is still ongoing. Now, when we get to this point, please consider the social, political, and economic reasons why a revolution would have occurred at this time. And this brings us to our surprise. Okay, here's a question. Why did the frog take the bus to work? I know, poor froggy. Because his car got towed. And my dears, you are welcome.